Kearney, Nebraska, July 14, 2003. The summer heat pressed down on Kearney like a thick blanket, even at 7:30 in the morning. Mary Turner stood at her kitchen counter, spreading peanut butter across slices of wheat bread with mechanical precision. Through the window above the sink, she could see the cornfields stretching endlessly toward the horizon, their green stalks swaying in the humid breeze that offered no real relief from the oppressive temperature. "Caleb, Ethan, breakfast is ready," she called out, her voice carrying through the modest two-story house on Elm Street. The thundering of footsteps answered her call. 11-year-old Caleb appeared first, his sandy blonde hair still damp from his shower, his Nebraska Cornhuskers t-shirt wrinkled from being pulled hastily from a drawer. Behind him came 9-year-old Ethan, smaller and darker-haired, with that perpetual gap-toothed grin that made Mary's heart swell every time she saw it. "Morning, Mom," Caleb said, sliding into his chair at the kitchen table. His voice had started changing recently, cracking at unexpected moments, and Mary noticed how he'd grown taller this summer, his feet now too big for last year's sneakers. Ethan climbed into his seat, swinging his legs beneath the table. "Can we go to the pool after school today? Tommy said his mom might take us." Mary placed plates of scrambled eggs and toast in front of them, then poured orange juice into their glasses. "We'll see, baby. Depends on if I can get off work early." She worked the afternoon shift at the Walmart on 2nd Avenue, stocking shelves and running the register during the slower hours. The pay wasn't much, but it was steady, and after the divorce, steady was what mattered. "You always say, 'We'll see,'" Ethan grumbled, but there was no real complaint in his voice. He was used to his mother's schedule, the way single-parent households operated on a different rhythm than other families. The kitchen radio played softly in the background. Local news, weather, the morning announcements. The forecaster predicted temperatures reaching 95 degrees by afternoon, with no rain in sight. The drought that had plagued central Nebraska all summer showed no signs of breaking. Mary watched her sons eat, committing the moment to memory without knowing why. Years later, she would replay this morning thousands of times, searching for something, anything, she might have done differently. But in that moment, it was just another Tuesday morning in the Turner household. "Remember, you're taking your bikes today," she reminded them. "I need the car for work, and your dad's picking you up at 4:30 for dinner." She tried to keep her voice neutral when mentioning Richard. The divorce had been finalized 3 months ago, in April, after 2 years of bitter fighting. The custody arrangement was still fresh, still awkward, with neither of them quite knowing how to navigate this new normal. Caleb's jaw tightened slightly. "Do we have to?" "Caleb," Mary said gently, sitting down across from them with her coffee. "He's still your father." "He's an asshole," Caleb muttered, loud enough for her to hear but quiet enough to maintain plausible deniability. "Language," Mary corrected automatically, though she couldn't entirely disagree. Richard had become someone she didn't recognize in the final year of their marriage. Angry, controlling, increasingly paranoid about her decisions regarding the boys. The judge had granted her primary custody after Richard failed to appear for 2 scheduled hearings, citing work obligations in Colorado where he'd relocated after the split. Ethan, always the peacemaker, changed the subject. "Mrs. Henderson said we're starting our pioneer unit today. We get to make butter from scratch." "That sounds fun," Mary said, grateful for her younger son's ability to diffuse tension. She glanced at the clock on the microwave, 7:52 a.m. "Okay, you two need to get moving. School starts in 40 minutes. The boys cleared their plates, dumped them in the sink, and raced upstairs for their backpacks. Mary packed their lunches into brown paper bags, sandwiches, carrot sticks, juice boxes, and the Oreos she'd bought on sale last week. She folded the bags closed and wrote their names on them with a marker, then set them on the counter near the door. When they thundered back downstairs, she handed each boy his lunch. "Straight into your backpacks. Don't lose them like last week." "That was Ethan's fault," Caleb protested. "Was not." "Boys," Mary said firmly, but she was smiling. Their constant bickering was as familiar as breathing. She walked them to the front door, watching as they grabbed their backpacks from the hooks in the entryway. The morning sun streamed through the screen door, painting everything in gold and amber light. Across the street, old Mrs. Patterson was already watering her roses, the garden hose creating tiny rainbows in the spray. "Be good today," Mary said, kissing first Caleb's forehead, then Ethan's. Caleb tried to squirm away, too old for Mom's kisses, he'd recently decided, but she caught him anyway. "Love you, Mom," Ethan said cheerfully. "Love you too, baby, both of you." She watched them walk down the driveway to where their bikes were propped against the garage. Caleb's was a red Huffy, slightly rusted around the handlebars. Ethan's was blue with white stripes, a hand-me-down from his brother that he'd claimed with pride when Caleb outgrew it. They mounted their bikes, waved back at her, and pedaled down Elm Street toward Lincoln Elementary School 15 blocks away. Mary stood in the doorway until they turned the corner at the end of the block and disappeared from sight. She didn't know it would be the last time she'd see them as children. By 10:30 that morning, Mary was on her hands and knees in the home goods aisle at Walmart, reorganizing dish towels that customers had pulled from their neat stacks. The store's air conditioning barely made a dent in the heat, and sweat prickled along her hairline as she worked. Her phone rang in her pocket, the Nokia flip phone she'd bought last month after finally giving in to the pressure to have a cell. The number on the screen was the school. "Hello? Mrs. Turner, this is Principal Morrison at Lincoln Elementary." The woman's voice carried a professional calm that immediately made Mary's stomach clench. "Yes? Is everything okay? Mrs. Turner, are your sons homesick today?" Mary stood up so quickly that she dropped a stack of towels. "No, they left for school this morning on their bikes." "Why? Aren't they there?" There was a pause, too long, pregnant with implications. "Mrs. Turner, neither Ethan nor Caleb checked in for attendance this morning. We waited until now to call in case they were running late or had an appointment, but their teachers haven't seen them at all today." The floor seemed to tilt beneath Mary's feet. "That's impossible. They left at 8 o'clock. They should have been there by 8:30, 8:40 at the latest. Have you tried calling your ex-husband? Could he have picked them up?" "No, Mary's mind raced. "He's picking them up at 4:30. He doesn't even live in Nebraska anymore. He's in Colorado. Mrs. Turner, I think you should come to the school. We've already called the police. They're on their way." The phone slipped in Mary's sweat-slicked hand. "I'm coming right now." She ran through the store, not bothering to clock out, not hearing her manager calling after her. In the parking lot, the sun beat down mercilessly as she fumbled with her keys, finally getting the door of her aging Honda Civic open. The drive to the school took 8 minutes that felt like 8 hours. 2 police cruisers were already parked in front of the building when she arrived. Mary burst through the front doors of Lincoln Elementary, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. Principal Morrison met her in the lobby, a woman in her mid-50s with gray-streaked hair and worry lines etched deep around her eyes. "Mrs. Turner, where are they?" Mary demanded. "Have you found them?" "Not yet. The police are speaking with the teachers and checking the grounds. Let's go to my office." Officer David Chen was waiting for them, a notepad already in his hands. He was young, maybe 30, with the kind of earnest face that suggested he hadn't seen too many serious cases yet in this quiet Nebraska town. His partner, Officer Sarah Williams, stood by the window, speaking quietly into her radio. "Mrs. Turner, I need you to tell me everything about this morning," Chen said gently. "What time did your sons leave? What route would they have taken?" Mary's hands shook as she described the morning. Breakfast, the bikes, the wave goodbye. Her voice cracked when she mentioned that she'd watched them turn the corner on Elm Street. "And you didn't notice anything unusual? No strange cars in the neighborhood? No one they might have mentioned who made them uncomfortable?" "No, nothing. It's Kearney. Everyone knows everyone. Things like this don't happen here." But even as she said it, Mary felt the cold reality settling over her like ice water. Things like this could happen anywhere. Officer Williams ended her radio call and turned to face them. "We've got units checking the route between the Turner residence and the school. We're also contacting the father. Richard didn't take them," Mary said firmly. "He wouldn't. He's difficult, but he wouldn't just take them." The officers exchanged a glance that Mary couldn't read. "Mrs. Turner, in cases involving children of divorce, we have to consider all possibilities." The next hours dissolved into a nightmare of questions, searches, and growing panic. By noon, the story had spread through Kearney like wildfire. Volunteers began arriving at the school. Parents, teachers, neighbors, strangers who'd heard on the local radio station. The temperature climbed to 93 degrees as search parties fanned out across the town. At 2:15 p.m., Officer Williams radioed back to the school. "We found something." Mary's knees went weak. Principal Morrison caught her arm, steadying her. "The bicycles," Williams continued. "Both of them. They're about 6 blocks from the school, leaned against a fence on County Road 40, near the old Morrison farm." "And the boys?" Chen asked urgently into his radio. Static crackled. "No sign of them, but officer, the bikes are neat. Parked carefully against the fence, kickstands down, and their backpacks are still on the handlebars. Lunches are still inside, completely untouched." Mary made a sound that was somewhere between a sob and a gasp. The lunches she'd packed that morning, the sandwiches and Oreos and juice boxes, still there, like her sons had simply evaporated into the sweltering Nebraska air. "We need to expand the search radius," Chen said. "Contact the state police, get more units out here, and someone find Richard Turner." Mary sank into a chair in Principal Morrison's office, her entire body trembling. Through the window she could see volunteers gathering in the parking lot, preparing to search the fields and farmland surrounding Kearney. The sky was cloudless and merciless, the sun beating down on a town that was about to learn that its children weren't as safe as everyone had always believed. Somewhere out there, Ethan and Caleb Turner had disappeared. Their bikes stood abandoned on a rural road, their lunches uneaten, their mother's last kiss still fresh on their foreheads. And in that moment, as the realization truly hit her, Mary Turner's world shattered into pieces that would take 20 years to even begin putting back together. Kearney, Nebraska, July 14-15, 2003. By 6 p.m., the Turner disappearance had become the lead story on every local news channel within 100 miles. The parking lot of Lincoln Elementary School had transformed into a makeshift command center, with news vans from Omaha and Lincoln crowding against police vehicles and volunteers' trucks. The evening sun cast long shadows across the pavement as temperatures finally began to drop from their afternoon peak. Detective Marcus Webb arrived from the Nebraska State Police just after 7. He was a tall man in his early 50s, with silver hair cropped short and eyes that had seen too many cases like this one. He found Mary Turner sitting in the school cafeteria, surrounded by neighbors who didn't know what to say but refused to leave her alone. Her sister Patricia had driven in from Grand Island and sat beside her, holding her hand in silence. "Mrs. Turner, I'm Detective Webb," he said, pulling up a chair across from her. His voice was low and steady, the kind that came from decades of delivering bad news and worse possibilities. "I'm taking over the investigation. I need to ask you some questions, and I know you've already answered them once, but I need to hear everything again." Mary looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes. She'd been crying on and off for hours until her tear ducts felt empty and raw. "Please just find my boys." "That's what we're going to do," Webb said, "but I need your help. Tell me about Richard." The cafeteria seemed to grow quieter, everyone straining to hear. "We divorced 3 months ago," Mary began, her voice hoarse. "April 15th. It was finalized after 2 years of fighting. Richard wanted full custody. He said I wasn't stable enough, that I couldn't provide for them properly." The words tasted bitter, but the judge saw through it. "She gave me primary custody and Richard got visitation every other weekend and Wednesday dinners." "How did he take the ruling?" Mary's hands twisted together in her lap. "He was angry, very angry. He stood up in the courtroom and told the judge she'd made a mistake, that she'd regret it. The bailiff had to ask him to sit down." Webb wrote something in his notebook. "And when was the last time you spoke to him?" "Last Friday. He called to confirm the pickup time for today. He was supposed to get them at 4:30 and have them back by 7. He's been living in Denver since May, working construction." Did he sound normal during that call? Mary thought back, trying to remember details that had seemed meaningless at the time. "He sounded tired, maybe, but normal. He asked about their summer activities, whether Caleb was still playing baseball. It wasn't a long conversation." Detective Webb looked up from his notes. "Mrs. Turner, I need to ask you directly. Do you think Richard could have taken the boys?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Patricia squeezed Mary's hand tighter. "I don't know," Mary whispered. 6 months ago, I would have said absolutely not. But lately, he's been different, angrier, more paranoid. He accused me of trying to turn the boys against him, which I never did. He said the court system was biased, that the whole thing was rigged." She paused, wiping her eyes. "But to just take them like this, without any contact? That doesn't seem like Richard either. He'd want me to know he had them just to hurt me." Webb nodded slowly. "We've been trying to reach him all day. His cell phone goes straight to voicemail. We contacted his employer in Denver. He didn't show up for work today. Called in sick yesterday, said he had the flu." The implication settled over Mary like a physical weight. "Oh God. We've issued a BOLO for his vehicle, a 2001 gray Ford F-150, Colorado plates. We've also contacted the FBI. When a parent is suspected in a child abduction case, especially across state lines, it becomes federal jurisdiction. But you don't know for sure it was him," Patricia interjected. "It could have been anyone. Some stranger. We're exploring all possibilities," Webb said carefully. "But statistically, in cases involving children this age, Family abduction is more common than stranger abduction, and the fact that the bikes were left so carefully, the backpacks untouched, it suggests the boys went with someone they knew, someone they trusted. Mary felt sick. The sandwiches she'd made that morning, the Oreos carefully packed, her sons had trusted whoever took them enough to leave everything behind. Denver, Colorado, July 15, 2003, 6:30 a.m. FBI Special Agent Jennifer Ramos stood outside the apartment complex where Richard Turner was listed as a resident. The building was a rundown structure on the outskirts of Denver, with peeling paint and a cracked parking lot that spoke of deferred maintenance and absent landlords. Richard's truck wasn't in his assigned spot. She'd driven through the night after getting the call about the Turner case. 20 years with the Bureau had taught her that the first 48 hours were everything. After that, the trail went cold fast. Her partner, Agent Michael Torres, was already at the building's main entrance, speaking with the property manager, a heavyset man in his 60s who looked like he'd been woken up specifically for this conversation. Mr. Holloway says Richard Turner paid his rent through the end of July, Torres reported as Ramos approached. Last saw him 3 days ago carrying some boxes to his truck. Didn't think anything of it. Boxes? Ramos repeated. Just normal moving stuff, he said. Figured Turner was reorganizing. They climbed the stairs to the second floor to apartment 2B. The door had a simple lock, no deadbolt. Ramos knocked loudly. Richard Turner, FBI, we need to speak with you. Silence. She knocked again, harder this time. Mr. Turner, if you're in there, please open the door. Nothing. Ramos exchanged a glance with Torres. We've got exigent circumstances. Missing children, suspected parental abduction. We're going in. Torres pulled out the building's master key that the manager had reluctantly provided. The lock clicked open, and they entered with their badges held high, announcing themselves repeatedly. The apartment was empty. Not just empty of people, empty of everything. The living room had no furniture, no pictures on the walls, no signs that anyone had lived there recently. In the bedroom, the closet doors stood open, revealing bare hangers. The bathroom medicine cabinet was cleared out. Even the refrigerator had been emptied and unplugged, its door propped open to prevent mold. Son of a bitch, Torres breathed. He cleaned the place out. Ramos walked through the apartment methodically, her trained eye cataloging every detail. In the kitchen trash can, she found a few discarded receipts. She pulled them out carefully. Gas station purchases from 3 days ago, a large order from McDonald's, and a receipt from a U-Haul rental facility. He rented a storage unit, she said, holding up the receipt. 5 days ago. And look at this. He bought 2 kids' meals at McDonald's 2 weeks back. He was in Nebraska. Torres was already on his phone. I'll get a warrant for the storage unit and contact the U-Haul place. We need to know where he went. Ramos stood in the middle of the empty apartment, trying to think like Richard Turner. Everything about this scene screamed premeditation. You didn't empty an entire apartment, rent a storage unit, and disappear on a whim. This had been planned, carefully and deliberately, which meant those boys might already be hundreds of miles away. Kearney, Nebraska, July 15, 2003, 2:00 p.m. The second day of searching brought no new leads. Temperatures climbed back into the mid-90s as volunteers combed through cornfields, abandoned buildings, and wooded areas around Kearney. The National Guard had been called in, bringing helicopters and infrared equipment. Dogs from the state K-9 unit followed scent trails that led nowhere, circling back to the fence where the bikes had been found as if the boys had simply vanished from that exact spot. Mary stood in her front yard, watching neighbors post missing person flyers on telephone poles. Someone had made hundreds of them overnight. Photos of Ethan and Caleb from last month's school pictures, smiling and innocent. Above bold text, missing. The word looked obscene in its simplicity. Detective Webb approached her, his expression grave. Mrs. Turner, we found Richard's apartment in Denver. It's been completely cleared out. We think he's been planning this for at least a week. Mary's knees buckled. Patricia caught her, held her upright. We've issued an Amber Alert, Webb continued. It's going out nationwide. Every police department, every news station, every highway patrol officer from here to California will be looking for Richard and the boys. We've got his photograph being broadcast on every channel. Someone will see them. He has a week's head start, Mary said dully. He could be anywhere. Not quite a week. We think he took them yesterday morning, which means he's had about 30 hours. That's still a lot of ground to cover, but he can't hide forever. He needs food, gas, somewhere to stay. Every transaction leaves a trail. But Mary had seen enough TV crime shows to know what Webb wasn't saying, that Richard could pay cash for everything, that he could avoid main highways, that he could hole up in some rural area where nobody asked questions. America was a big country, full of places where 3 people could disappear if they were careful. A commotion near the street drew their attention. A news van from CNN had just pulled up, joining the local media already camped on the block. A reporter in a crisp suit stepped out, followed by a cameraman. "Mrs. Turner," the reporter called out, "would you be willing to make a statement? We're broadcasting nationally." Webb started to wave them off, but Mary stopped him. "Wait, if Richard is watching TV somewhere, I want him to see this." She walked to the edge of her yard where the cameras quickly assembled. Microphones were thrust toward her face, and she suddenly understood the term media circus. But she pushed down her discomfort and looked directly into the nearest camera lens. "Richard, if you can hear me, please bring our boys home. Whatever you're angry about, whatever problems we have, Ethan and Caleb don't deserve this. They need their home, their school, their friends, they need their mother." Her voice broke, but she forced herself to continue. "I know you love them. I know you think you're doing what's best. But this isn't right. Please, just call me. Let me know they're safe. We can work something out." The reporter jumped in. "Mrs. Turner, do you have any message for Ethan and Caleb directly?" Mary's tears flowed freely now. "I love you both so much. I'm looking for you every second of every day. Be brave, be strong, and know that I will never stop searching. Never." The segment would air on national news within the hour. Mary's tearful plea would be replayed thousands of times, her face becoming synonymous with every parent's worst nightmare. But in a cheap motel room outside Cheyenne, Wyoming, Richard Turner watched his ex-wife on the muted television and felt only contempt. In the adjoining room, his sons slept soundly, believing the story he'd told them, that their mother had been in a terrible accident and they were driving to see her one last time before she died. Richard picked up the remote and turned off the TV. Tomorrow they'd be in Montana. By the end of the week, they'd have new names, new identities, and a new life where Mary Turner couldn't poison his sons' minds against him anymore. He'd saved them, he told himself. He was the good guy in this story. The truth, like so many things in the Turner case, was far more complicated than anyone realized. Kearney, Nebraska, July 22, 2003. 1 week had passed since Ethan and Caleb Turner disappeared, and the investigation had consumed the entire state. The FBI's Denver field office had taken operational control, coordinating with local police departments across 7 states. Mary Turner's living room had become an unofficial headquarters, with phone lines installed specifically for tips and volunteers rotating shifts to answer calls that came in at all hours. Special Agent Jennifer Ramos sat across from Mary at the kitchen table, reviewing financial records that had been subpoenaed from Richard's bank. The morning sun filtered through the curtains, illuminating dust motes that drifted lazily through the air. Outside, a news crew was setting up for yet another live shot, though the story was beginning to lose its urgency in the national media cycle. A new scandal in Washington was dominating headlines. Richard withdrew $15,000 from his savings account on July 10th, Ramos said, sliding a bank statement across the table. That was 4 days before the boys went missing. It was nearly everything he had. Mary studied the document, her finger tracing the withdrawal notation. "I didn't even know he had that much saved." During the divorce proceedings, he claimed he was barely making ends meet. "People lie about finances in divorce cases," Ramos replied. "But this tells us something important. He'd been planning this for a while. You don't pull out that kind of cash unless you're preparing to go off-grid." Detective Webb entered through the back door, shaking rain from his jacket. The drought had finally broken 2 days ago, and Nebraska had been soaked with intermittent thunderstorms ever since. "We got something from the U-Haul place," he announced, pulling up a chair. Richard rented a 10 by 10 storage unit in Aurora on July 9th. "Paid 6 months in advance, cash. Have you searched it?" Mary asked immediately. "We got the warrant this morning. Unit's empty except for some basic furniture. A couch, a couple of chairs, boxes of kitchen stuff. Nothing that helps us locate him." Webb paused, consulting his notes. But the manager remembered Richard, said he made multiple trips, brought in supplies over several days, talked about moving to Wyoming for a new job. "Wyoming," Ramos repeated, her jaw tightening. "That's where the last confirmed sighting was, the gas station outside Cheyenne on July 14th. After that, nothing." Mary felt the familiar wave of despair that had become her constant companion. Every lead seemed to evaporate like water on hot pavement. So he could be anywhere west of here by now. Montana, Idaho, Washington, Oregon. Or he could have doubled back, Webb interjected. Could be in Kansas or Oklahoma. Could have gone south into New Mexico. We're working every angle. The phone rang, its shrill sound cutting through the conversation. Mary reached for it automatically, her heart racing the way it did every time, hoping this would be the call that changed everything. Turner residence. Is this Mary Turner? The voice was male, unfamiliar, with a slight southern accent. Yes, who is this? Ma'am, my name is Gerald Hutchins. I'm calling from Lubbock, Texas. I saw your boys on the news and I think I might have seen them. Mary's hand flew to her chest. She gestured frantically at Ramos and Webb, who both moved closer. When? Where? 3 days ago at a truck stop off Interstate 27. I was fueling up my rig and I saw this man with 2 boys. The younger one looked exactly like your Ethan, same dark hair, same size. They were getting into a pickup truck, Colorado plates, I think, though I didn't get the full number. What were they doing? Did the boys seem scared? There was a pause. That's the thing, ma'am. They looked normal. The man had his hand on the older boy's shoulder, kind of steering him toward the truck. The younger one was eating an ice cream cone. They didn't look distressed or nothing. Ramos was already on her cell phone, calling the FBI office in Lubbock. Webb scribbled notes furiously. Mr. Hutchins, did you notice anything else? What the man looked like? What he was wearing? Tall guy, maybe 6'1", 6'2", had a baseball cap on, couldn't see his face too well, wearing jeans and a work shirt. The truck was gray, I'm pretty sure about that. Beat up, looked like a work vehicle. It matched Richard's description and his truck perfectly. The FBI is going to want to talk to you, Mary said, her voice shaking. Can you stay on the line? Yes, ma'am, I should have called sooner, but I wasn't sure it was them until I saw the news again this morning. My wife convinced me to call. Ramos took over the call, asking detailed questions while Webb contacted the Texas Highway Patrol. Mary stood and walked to the window, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. Texas. Richard had driven her boys to Texas more than 800 miles from home. By noon, the Lubbock sighting had been confirmed by security footage from the truck stop. The image was grainy and taken from a distance, but forensic analysts at the FBI were confident it showed Richard Turner with 2 children matching Ethan and Caleb's descriptions. The timestamp read, July 19, 2003, 4:47 p.m. He's heading south, Ramos said, studying a map spread across the dining room table. Red pins marked confirmed sightings. Cheyenne on July 14th, now Lubbock on July 19th. Probably making for the Mexican border. Mexico? Mary's voice rose in panic. If he gets them across the border, we've alerted Border Patrol at every crossing from California to Texas, Webb assured her. Richard's photo is at every checkpoint. They won't get through. But Mary knew what they weren't saying, that the U.S.-Mexico border was over 1,900 miles long, that there were countless unofficial crossings, that desperate people found ways through every single day. Somewhere in West Texas, July 22, 2003, Caleb Turner sat in the back of his father's truck, watching the endless desert landscape roll past the window. They'd been driving for over a week now, stopping at cheap motels with peeling wallpaper and flickering neon signs. His father kept saying they were almost there, that they'd reach the place where Mom was waiting soon, but Caleb was starting to have doubts. Beside him, Ethan was asleep, his head resting against the window, mouth slightly open. At 9 years old, Ethan still believed everything Dad told them, but Caleb was 11, and he'd started noticing things that didn't add up. The story Dad told them, that Mom had been in a terrible car accident, that she was in a hospital in California and wanted to see them one last time, had made sense at first. Dad had met them on their bikes that morning, crying and upset, saying they had to leave right away. Caleb had been so scared that he'd climbed into the truck without questioning anything. But now, over a week later, they were going south instead of west. And when Caleb had asked to call the hospital to talk to Mom, Dad had gotten angry, said the doctors weren't allowing phone calls because she was too weak. When Caleb pressed further, asking for the hospital's name, Dad had pulled over to the side of the highway and yelled at him for being disrespectful during a family crisis. Since then, Caleb had kept his questions to himself, but he watched. He noticed how Dad paid for everything with cash, how he avoided main highways, how he turned off the radio whenever news came on. He noticed how Dad had made them both dye their hair darker in a motel bathroom 3 days ago, saying it was just temporary, that it would wash out. And he noticed that every time they stopped for gas, Dad positioned himself between them and other people, keeping a hand on their shoulders, smiling that tight smile that never reached his eyes. Something was wrong. Caleb didn't know what exactly, but his stomach had been twisted in knots for days. "You awake?" Dad's voice came from the front seat. He was looking at Caleb in the rearview mirror. "Yeah, we're going to stop soon. Get some food, find a place to sleep. Tomorrow we'll keep moving." "Where are we going?" Caleb asked carefully. "I told you, to see your mother." "But when?" "We've been driving forever." Dad's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Don't start, Caleb. We'll get there when we get there. Your mother is very sick and we're doing the best we can." Ethan stirred awake, rubbing his eyes. "Are we there yet?" "Soon, buddy," Dad said, his voice softening for his younger son. "Want to stop at McDonald's for dinner?" "Yeah." Ethan perked up immediately, but Caleb stayed quiet, staring out at the desert, at the endless expanse of nothing that stretched in every direction. He thought about their house in Kearney, about his friends and his baseball team and his teacher, Mrs. Henderson. He thought about the morning they'd left, how normal it had seemed, how Mom had kissed them goodbye and told them to be good. A terrible thought was beginning to form in his mind, one that he kept pushing away but that returned stronger each time. What if Mom hadn't been in an accident? What if Dad was lying? What if... No, he couldn't think like that. Dad was their father. He loved them. He wouldn't lie about something so serious. Would he? Kearney, Nebraska, August 10th, 2003. 4 weeks after the disappearance, the FBI held a press conference to update the public on the investigation. Agent Ramos stood behind a podium bristling with microphones, her expression professionally neutral despite the exhaustion evident in the lines around her eyes. "We are actively pursuing multiple leads in the Turner case," she announced to the assembled reporters. "We have confirmed sightings of Richard Turner with 2 children matching Ethan and Caleb's descriptions in Wyoming and Texas. We are working with law enforcement agencies across the Southwest and have increased surveillance at all border crossings." "Agent Ramos, is it true the trail has gone cold after the Lubbock sighting?" a reporter called out. "We continue to receive and investigate tips daily. The case is very much active. What would you say to Richard Turner if he's watching this?" Ramos looked directly into the cameras. "Mr. Turner, you need to understand that this won't end well for you. Every law enforcement agency in the country is looking for you. You cannot run forever. The best thing you can do for your sons is to bring them home safely. Turn yourself in, and let's resolve this before anyone gets hurt." But by that point, Richard Turner had already successfully crossed into Mexico using a back road near Presidio, Texas. He'd obtained fake documents for himself and the boys from a contact he'd met during his construction work in Denver. 3 days later, they boarded a bus in Monterrey headed for Mexico City, where Richard had arranged work through another contact. No questions asked, cash under the table. The boys he'd once called Ethan and Caleb were now Mateo and Diego Hernandez, sons of Roberto Hernandez, a construction worker from Guadalajara. Their school records had been forged. Their past had been erased. And in a rented apartment in a working-class neighborhood of Mexico City, Richard Turner began the process of making his sons forget their mother ever existed. Kearney, Nebraska, December 2003. Snow fell softly on Elm Street the day Mary Turner took down the Christmas lights she'd strung across her porch. She'd put them up in November, telling herself that when Ethan and Caleb came home, she wanted the house to look festive and welcoming. But Christmas had come and gone, and the lights now seemed like a cruel joke. Detective Webb visited her that afternoon, stamping snow from his boots in the entryway. 5 months into the investigation, his visits had become less frequent. The case was still open, still active, but the daily urgency had faded into a grim routine of following leads that went nowhere. "I wanted to tell you in person," Webb said, accepting the coffee Mary offered him. "The FBI is scaling back the active investigation. They're not closing the case, but they're reassigning most of the agents to other priorities. The case will remain open, and any new leads will be investigated immediately." Mary had known this was coming. She'd seen it in the decreasing number of phone calls, the longer gaps between updates. "So you're giving up?" "We're not giving up," Webb said firmly. "But Mary, it's been 5 months. Richard could be anywhere. Mexico, Central America, South America. We think he left the country, and that makes this exponentially harder. International investigations require cooperation with foreign governments, and that process is slow." "What am I supposed to do?" Mary asked, her voice breaking. "Just wait? Just hope that someday somehow they'll come back?" Webb set down his coffee cup and met her eyes. You keep living. You keep their memory alive. You work with the missing children organizations, keep their faces in the public eye, and you trust that someday something will break. These cases, sometimes they take years, but they do get solved. Ethan and Caleb are out there somewhere. Don't lose hope. But hope was becoming harder to hold on to. As winter deepened and 2003 gave way to 2004, the Turner case began its slow fade from public consciousness. The missing person flyers yellowed and tore. The news crews stopped calling. The volunteers moved on to other tragedies. Mary Turner was left alone with her grief, her guilt, and her unshakable belief that somewhere her sons were still alive, still waiting for her to find them. She had no way of knowing that she was right, and that it would take 20 years before the truth finally came to light. Kearney, Nebraska, July 14, 2008. 5 years to the day after her sons disappeared, Mary Turner stood in front of Lincoln Elementary School with a small group of supporters. The gathering had shrunk considerably from the hundreds who'd shown up in those first desperate weeks. Now it was just 15 people, mostly members of local missing children advocacy groups, a handful of neighbors who refused to forget, and Patricia, who'd driven in from Grand Island like she did every year on this date. Mary held a poster-sized photograph of Ethan and Caleb, their faces frozen at 9 and 11 years old. They would be 14 and 16 now, she said to the local news camera that had bothered to show up. Ethan would be starting high school. Caleb would be learning to drive. And I don't know where they are, but I know they're out there. I know they're alive. The reporter, a young woman who hadn't even been working in Nebraska when the case broke, asked the obligatory questions with professional sympathy. Mary gave the same answer she'd given for 5 years, her words worn smooth like river stones from repetition. After the cameras left, Patricia walked Mary back to her car. "You look tired," her sister said gently. "I am tired," Mary admitted, "but I can't stop. The moment I stop, it's like admitting they're gone forever." She'd become an expert on missing children in the past 5 years. She knew the statistics, that after the first year, the chances of finding a missing child dropped dramatically, that parental abductions across international borders had dismal recovery rates, that most cases like hers never got solved. But she also knew the exceptions. She'd met other parents at conferences and support groups, people who'd found their children after 10 years, 15 years, even 20. She clung to those stories like lifelines. "The investigator I hired thinks Richard might be in South America," Mary said as they reached her Honda. The car was the same one she'd driven in 2003, now held together by prayers and duct tape. There were some possible sightings in Ecuador last year, but nothing confirmed. Patricia's face showed concern. "Mary, how much have you spent on private investigators?" "It doesn't matter." "It does matter. You're going to bankrupt yourself." "I said it doesn't matter." Mary's voice rose sharply, then broke. "What else am I supposed to do with the money? Buy nice things, go on vacation? My sons are out there somewhere, Patricia. Money means nothing if I can't bring them home." Her sister pulled her into a hug, and Mary let herself cry on Patricia's shoulder, something she rarely allowed herself to do anymore. She'd learned to function through the grief, to compartmentalize the pain so she could work her job at Walmart, pay her bills, and maintain the facade of normalcy. But on this day every year, the facade cracked. Mexico City, Mexico, July 14, 2008. Diego Hernandez, the boy who'd once been Ethan Turner, sat at the kitchen table of their small apartment, trying to focus on his summer reading assignment. At 14, he was tall for his age, with his father's build and his mother's dark eyes, though he had no memory of the woman who'd given birth to him. His older brother Mateo was in their shared bedroom, probably on the computer their father had finally bought them last year. Mateo had become obsessed with American websites lately, something that made their father nervous, though he wouldn't explain why. Roberto, their father, worked long hours at a construction company, leaving before dawn and returning after dark. He'd provided for them adequately over the years, moving them from Mexico City to Monterrey and back again, always for work, he said. They'd never stayed in one place longer than 2 years. Diego had been too young to remember much about the move from the United States when he was 9. The memories he did have were fuzzy and dreamlike. A big house, a yard with trees, a woman's voice singing. But whenever he asked about their mother or their life before Mexico, his father's face would close off, and he'd say the same thing he always said. "Your mother died when you were very young. It's too painful to talk about." Mateo claimed to remember more, though he rarely shared those memories with Diego. There was something distant about his older brother lately, something troubled that Diego couldn't quite understand. The apartment door opened, and their father walked in, covered in drywall dust and looking exhausted. "Boys," he greeted them, heading straight for the shower. Diego returned to his book, but his concentration was broken. He found himself staring at the photograph on the living room wall, the only picture they had of their family. It showed the three of them at the beach in Puerto Vallarta 3 years ago, all smiling at the camera. But there was something staged about it, something that had always bothered Diego, though he couldn't articulate what. In the bedroom, Mateo stared at his computer screen, his heart pounding. He'd found something that changed everything. He'd been researching American missing persons cases for a school project, or that's what he'd told himself, though deep down he knew he was searching for something specific, something that had been nagging at him for years, growing stronger as he got older. The memories his father said didn't exist, the flash of a different face when he looked in the mirror sometimes, the way Spanish had felt foreign in his mouth when they first arrived in Mexico, even though his father insisted they'd always spoken it at home. And now, on a website for the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, he'd found them. 2 boys from Nebraska, disappeared in 2003. One named Caleb, 11 years old. One named Ethan, 9 years old. The age-progressed photos showed what they might look like now, at 16 and 14. Mateo was looking at his own face, and his brother's. His hands shook as he clicked through the case details. The mother's name was Mary Turner. The father, the suspected abductor, was Richard Turner. There was a photograph of the man. It was his father, younger but unmistakably the same person. Mateo heard the shower turn off in the bathroom. He quickly closed the browser window, his mind racing. Everything he'd believed about his life, his identity, his past, it was a lie. All of it. He looked at the closed bedroom door, behind which Diego was innocently doing homework, unaware that their entire world was built on deception. What was he supposed to do with this information? Confront their father? No, not their father. Richard Turner? A kidnapper? Contact the police? Run? And what about Diego? His brother was only 14. Should he tell him? Would Diego even believe him? Mateo's hands were still shaking as he heard footsteps approaching the bedroom. He quickly opened a different website, something innocuous about football. Their father, Richard, opened the door, wearing clean clothes, his hair still wet. "Dinner in an hour," he said. "I'm making spaghetti." "Okay," Mateo managed to say, his voice surprisingly steady. Richard studied him for a moment, and Mateo felt his heart rate spike. Could his father see the knowledge written on his face? But then Richard just nodded and closed the door. Mateo sat frozen for a long moment, then slowly reopened the missing children website. He stared at the photo of Mary Turner, the woman labeled as his mother. She was older in the picture, with lines of grief etched deep around her eyes. The photo had been taken at a vigil, holding a poster with his and Diego's faces on it. His real name was Caleb. His brother was Ethan. They'd been stolen from their mother 25 years ago. No, 5 years ago. Math was suddenly difficult when your entire timeline had been rewritten. He read Mary Turner's statement. "I know my sons are alive. I will never stop looking for them." Something broke inside Mateo's chest. No, Caleb's chest. He put his hand over his mouth to stifle a sob. His mother hadn't abandoned them. She hadn't died. She'd been searching for them all this time, and he had no idea how to get back to her. Kearney, Nebraska, March 2010. Detective Webb retired from the Nebraska State Police in early 2010, but before he left, he made one final visit to Mary Turner. He found her in her living room, which had become a shrine to her missing sons. The walls were covered with age-progressed photos, maps with pins marking possible sightings, newspaper clippings, and handwritten timelines. "I wanted to tell you myself," Webb said, sitting in the worn armchair he'd occupied countless times over the years. "I'm retiring next month." Mary felt a wave of panic. Webb had been her anchor, the one constant in an investigation that had long since been downgraded to cold case status. "What about Ethan and Caleb?" "The case stays open," Webb assured her. "Detective Sarah Chen is taking over as lead investigator. She's good, Mary. She'll keep working it." "But you know everything," Mary protested. "All the details, all the leads, it's all documented. Sarah has access to everything." Webb leaned forward, his weathered face kind. "Mary, I need to tell you something, and I need you to really hear me. This case may never be solved. Richard Turner has evaded capture for almost 7 years. He could be using a different name, the boys could be using different names, they could be anywhere in the world. And even if we found them tomorrow, Ethan and Caleb aren't the same boys you knew. They're teenagers now. They may not even remember you." "I know that," Mary said quietly. "But they're still my sons." Webb nodded slowly. "I'm not telling you to give up. I'm telling you that you also need to live. You're 43 years old, Mary. You've put your entire life on hold for 7 years. At some point, you have to figure out how to move forward while still keeping hope alive." After Webb left, Mary sat alone in her living room, surrounded by the faces of her lost children. She'd heard variations of this speech before, from her sister, from therapists, from well-meaning friends. Everyone wanted her to move on, to find closure, to start living again. But how could she move on when her sons were still out there? How could she find closure without answers? How could she start living when half her heart was missing? She picked up the phone and dialed the number she'd called hundreds of times before, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. "Hi, this is Mary Turner. I'm calling about case number 03NE1287. I just wanted to check if there've been any new leads. Monterrey, Mexico, June 2012. Caleb, still going by Mateo, was 18 years old when he finally decided to act on what he'd known for 4 years. He'd kept the secret, watching his father carefully, trying to find the right moment that never seemed to come. Diego was 16 now, old enough to understand, old enough to handle the truth. They were alone in the apartment, Richard having left for a 3-day job in Guadalajara. Caleb had been waiting for this opportunity. "Diego, I need to show you something," he said, his voice serious enough that his brother immediately put down his phone. "What's wrong?" "Everything," Caleb said. "Everything about our lives is wrong, and I've known about it for 4 years. And I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner, but I need you to see this now." He opened his laptop and navigated to the Missing Children website. "This is us. Our real names are Caleb and Ethan Turner. We're from Nebraska. Our mother is alive and she's been looking for us since 2003. Diego stared at the screen, his face going pale. That's crazy. That's not us. Look at the faces, Diego. Look at the age progression. That's you. That's me. Dad said Mom died. Dad lied about everything. His real name is Richard Turner. He kidnapped us after losing a custody battle. We were taken from our mother 9 years ago." Diego stood up abruptly, backing away from the computer. No, you're wrong. You're confused." "I'm not confused." Caleb's voice rose in frustration. "I remember things, Diego. I remember a house with a big yard. I remember a woman with light brown hair who made us sandwiches. I remember bikes. We had bikes, red and blue, and we were riding them to school when Dad picked us up." "Stop it. Her name is Mary. Mary Turner. She's our mother, and she's been searching for us for 9 years, and we need to contact her." Diego's eyes filled with tears. "But Dad, he loves us. He takes care of us. He wouldn't." "He did," Caleb said firmly. "And I know it's hard, and I know it's scary, but we deserve to know the truth. Our real mother deserves to know we're alive." The brothers stared at each other across the small apartment, 9 years of lies hanging between them like smoke. Outside, Monterey hummed with evening traffic, oblivious to the moment of revelation happening in apartment 4C. Finally, Diego whispered, "What do we do?" Caleb took a deep breath. "We call her. We find a way to get back home." But it wouldn't be that simple. Nothing about the Turner case had ever been simple, and the road back to Kearney, Nebraska, would take 11 more years and a chain of events that nobody could have predicted. Monterrey, Mexico, June 2012. The hours after Caleb's revelation passed in a blur of tears, arguments, and stunned silence. Diego sat on his bed, staring at the laptop screen that showed Mary Turner's face, his mother's face, over and over in different news clips and anniversary vigils. Each time she spoke, saying she knew they were alive, that she'd never stop searching. Something twisted painfully in his chest. "We need to be smart about this," Caleb said, pacing the small bedroom. "If we just call the police or contact her directly, Dad will find out. He could run, take us somewhere else, somewhere we'd never be found." "So what do we do?" Diego asked, his voice raw from crying. "We gather evidence, documentation. We take photos of ourselves, our IDs, anything that proves who we are now and who we were. We create a backup plan." Caleb sat down beside his brother. "And we wait for the right opportunity." "How long?" Caleb didn't have an answer. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Richard returned from Guadalajara none the wiser, and the brothers maintained their careful facade while secretly preparing for an escape that seemed increasingly impossible. The problem was money. At 18 and 16, They had no savings, no access to funds that Richard didn't control. They had no passports. Richard had destroyed their fake Mexican documents years ago, claiming they'd been lost and had never replaced them. They were trapped not by walls but by circumstance, by age, by the labyrinth of bureaucracy that made crossing back into the United States without documentation nearly impossible. "We could go to the American embassy," Diego suggested one night after Richard had gone to bed. Caleb shook his head. "Dad watches us too closely. He'd notice if we went to Mexico City without him, and if we tried and failed, he'd know we were onto him. He'd move us again, maybe somewhere with no internet, no access to information." So they waited and watched and planned. Caleb turned 19, then 20. Diego finished high school, the Mexican school they attended with forged transcripts. Richard grew older, grayer, more suspicious. He'd developed a paranoid streak over the years, constantly checking over his shoulder, suddenly moving them to different apartments with no explanation. Kearney, Nebraska, July 14, 2015. Mary Turner was 50 years old, and her sons had been gone for 12 years. The annual vigil had dwindled to just her, Patricia, and 3 members of a missing children support group. No news crews came anymore. The case was ancient history, buried under thousands of newer tragedies. Detective Sarah Chen still called once a month with updates, but the updates were always the same. No new leads, no credible sightings. The case remained open, but inactive. The FBI had officially closed their investigation in 2010, though they'd assured Mary they'd reopen it immediately if new information emerged. Mary had stopped seeing the therapist her insurance covered. The woman had meant well, but she kept trying to guide Mary toward acceptance, toward moving forward with her life, as if moving forward wasn't a betrayal of everything she'd fought for. She'd also stopped dating after a disastrous relationship in 2013, with a man who'd seemed understanding at first, but eventually admitted he couldn't handle being with someone who was still married to her grief. Mary had told him that grief wasn't something you divorced. It was part of you, woven into your DNA, and either people understood that or they didn't. Her house had become a time capsule. Ethan and Caleb's bedrooms remained exactly as they'd been in 2003. The posters on the walls, the toys on the shelves, the beds made with the same sheets. Patricia said it was unhealthy. The therapist had said it was preventing closure. Mary said it was her house and her choice. She worked full-time at Walmart now, having been promoted to department manager. The money was better, which meant she could afford to keep paying the private investigator she'd hired 5 years ago. He'd followed leads through Mexico and into Guatemala before losing the trail completely in 2013. But she kept him on retainer anyway, just in case. At night, Mary scrolled through social media, searching for faces that might be her sons. She'd become adept at recognizing features, the shape of a jawline, the set of eyes, the way someone smiled. She'd contacted dozens of young men over the years, asking politely if they'd been adopted or if they knew anything about their early childhood. Most ignored her. A few responded with confusion or irritation. None were her sons. She'd also created a website, Find Ethan and Caleb, that she updated regularly with age-progressed photos and information about the case. The site got a few hundred visitors a month, mostly true crime enthusiasts and other parents of missing children, but it stayed online, a beacon in the darkness, in case Ethan and Caleb ever went looking for themselves. "What if they don't remember me?" Mary asked Patricia one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the summer sun set over Kearney. They'd be 21 and 23 now. What if Richard told them I was dead, or that I abandoned them? What if they don't want to be found? "Then you deal with that when it happens," Patricia said gently. "But you can't give up on the possibility that they do remember, that they are looking for you. You've come too far to stop now." Mary nodded, though the weight of 12 years pressed down on her shoulders like stones. How much longer could she carry this burden? How many more years of hoping and searching and waiting? She didn't know that at that very moment, 1,900 miles away, her oldest son was composing an email that would take 3 more years to finally send. San Luis Potosi, Mexico, November 2018. Richard Turner was 61 years old and dying. The diagnosis had come 6 months earlier. Stage 4 lung cancer metastasized to his liver and bones. The doctors gave him a year at most. He'd been a heavy smoker his entire adult life, and now it was catching up with him. Caleb and Diego, now 24 and 26, had moved with him to San Luis Potosi when Richard could no longer work construction. They'd found jobs at a small manufacturing plant, barely making enough to cover rent and Richard's medical expenses. The Mexican healthcare system was cheaper than American, but cancer treatment still devoured what little money they had. Richard spent most days in bed, hooked up to an oxygen tank, coughing violently into blood-stained tissues. The brothers took turns caring for him, though the role reversal felt surreal. This was the man who'd stolen their childhood, who'd lied to them for 15 years, who'd destroyed their mother's life. And yet he was also the man who'd raised them, taught them to ride bikes. Again, after they'd forgotten, helped with homework, attended school events, cooked dinner every night. The complexity of their feelings toward Richard was something neither brother could fully articulate. One evening in late November, Richard called them both into his bedroom. His face was gaunt, his cheeks hollow, his skin gray. He looked like a ghost of himself. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice a raspy whisper. "About your mother." Caleb and Diego exchanged glances. They'd never told Richard that they knew the truth. For 6 years, they'd maintained the fiction, waiting for circumstances that would allow them to escape. "She didn't die when you were young," Richard continued, struggling for breath. "I lied to you about that. I took you from her in 2003 after the divorce. I thought I was saving you. I thought she was poisoning you against me, turning you into something you weren't supposed to be." He coughed, a wet, rattling sound. "I was wrong." Diego's hands clenched into fists. "We know." Richard's eyes widened slightly. "You know?" "We've known for years," Caleb said coldly. "Since 2012. We found the missing persons reports online. We know you kidnapped us. We know our real names are Caleb and Ethan Turner. We know our mother has been searching for us for 15 years. The silence that followed was heavy with 15 years of deception, anger, and grief. "Why didn't you leave?" Richard finally asked. "Why didn't you contact her?" "Because we had no money, no documentation, no way to cross the border legally," Caleb said. "Because we were trapped in the life you built for us. Because you made sure we couldn't escape." Richard closed his eyes and a tear slid down his weathered cheek. "I'm sorry. God help me, I'm so sorry. I thought I was doing the right thing, but all I did was destroy everyone's lives, yours, your mother's, mine." He opened his eyes again, looking at each of them. "When I'm gone, you need to go back. Find your mother. Tell her. Tell her I'm sorry, and that you were loved, even if everything else was a lie." "We don't need your permission," Diego said, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. "I know." Richard's breath was coming in short gasps now. "There's money. $5,000 hidden in a box under my bed. I've been saving it for years. For this. For when you could finally go home." He coughed again violently. "My real name is Richard Turner. I was born in Lincoln, Nebraska in 1957. Social security number is 498-72-6301. Use that information. It'll help prove who you are when you go back." Caleb felt a complex mix of emotions: anger, pity, grief, and something that might have been gratitude. "Why are you telling us this now?" "Because I'm dying, and I don't want to die with this lie between us anymore." Richard's eyes were closing, exhaustion overtaking him. "I loved you boys. That part was never a lie." Richard Turner died 3 weeks later, on December 7th, in a small hospital in San Luis Potosí. His final words were, "Tell Mary I'm sorry." The brothers arranged a simple cremation. They didn't keep the ashes. San Luis Potosí, Mexico, January 2019. With Richard dead and $5,000 in their possession, Caleb and Diego finally had the means to attempt a return to the United States. But the process was far more complicated than they'd anticipated. They had no American identification, no birth certificates, no proof of citizenship. The documents Richard had used to enter Mexico 15 years ago had long since disappeared. They were, effectively, stateless. Men in their mid-20s with no legal identity in either country. "We need to contact the American embassy," Caleb said, sitting at the small table in their apartment with his laptop open. "They can verify our identities through fingerprints and DNA. Mom's DNA is on file from the original investigation." "And then what?" Diego asked. "They'll want to know why we didn't come forward sooner, why we stayed with Richard all these years. We were children when he took us. We were adults when we found out, but we were trapped. No money, no documentation. They'll understand that." But Diego's concern wasn't entirely unfounded. When they went to the American embassy in Mexico City in February, presenting their story to a skeptical consular officer, the process became immediately complicated. "You're claiming to be missing American citizens from a 15-year-old kidnapping case," the officer said. reviewing the missing persons reports Caleb had printed out. You understand we'll need to verify this through multiple channels. This isn't something we can resolve quickly. We understand, Caleb said. We're willing to do DNA tests, fingerprint analysis, whatever you need. The officer studied them both carefully. How long have you known about your real identities? Since 2012, Caleb admitted. But our father, our abductor, controlled everything. We had no resources, no way to leave Mexico safely. We were waiting for the right opportunity. And your father is deceased? 3 months ago. Cancer. The process that followed was bureaucratic nightmare. DNA samples were taken and sent to the FBI lab in Quantico. Fingerprints were compared against records from Nebraska. Dental records from their childhood were requested and compared to current X-rays. The embassy contacted Detective Sarah Chen in Kearney, who nearly dropped the phone when she heard the news. Are you certain it's them? Chen asked, her voice shaking. DNA results will take several weeks, the embassy official said. But the preliminary evidence is compelling. The age-progressed photos match. The boys, men now, know details about the case that weren't public knowledge. And they provided Richard Turner's social security number, which we verified as authentic. Does Mary Turner know yet? We're waiting for DNA confirmation before we contact her. We don't want to give false hope. But in a small town like Kearney, news traveled fast. Someone at the Nebraska State Police mentioned to someone else that there might be a break in the Turner case. That person told their spouse, who mentioned it to a friend at the grocery store. And within 48 hours, Patricia was calling Mary with the rumor. I heard something at the bank, Patricia said, her voice careful. Someone said there's been a development in Ethan and Caleb's case. Have you heard from Detective Chen? Mary's hand started shaking. No, nothing. What kind of development? I don't know details, maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's just a rumor. But Mary immediately called Chen, who hedged and redirected and finally admitted, Mary, I can't give you specifics yet, but there's a possibility, and I emphasize possibility, that we may have located your sons. I need you to not get your hopes up until we have confirmation. I'll call you the moment I know anything definitive. Mary sat down on her kitchen floor and sobbed for the first time in years. Great heaving sobs that felt like they were tearing her apart from the inside. 16 years of grief and hope and desperation poured out of her in waves. Patricia drove immediately to Kearney and found her sister on the floor, still crying. She held Mary while they both wept, afraid to hope, unable not to. Kearney, Nebraska, March 10th, 2023. The DNA results came back on a Friday afternoon. Detective Sarah Chen drove to Mary Turner's house with the official report in a sealed envelope. Her hands trembled as she knocked on the door. Mary opened it immediately, as if she'd been waiting by the door all day, which she had been. Is it them? Mary asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Chen's face broke into a smile through her own tears. It's them, Mary. It's really them. Ethan and Caleb are alive and they're coming home. Mary's legs gave out. Chen caught her, helped her to the couch where Mary collapsed into gasping sobs that were equal parts joy and grief and relief so profound it felt physical. Where are they? When can I see them? Are they okay? They're in Mexico City, working with the embassy to get emergency passports issued. They should be back in the United States within 2 weeks. Chen squeezed Mary's hand. Mary, I need to prepare you. They're not the boys you remember. They're 29 and 31 years old now. They've lived an entire life that you weren't part of. They go by different names, Mateo and Diego. They speak Spanish fluently. They have memories and experiences that don't include you. I don't care, Mary said fiercely. I don't care if they're different. They're alive. They're coming home. That's all that matters. Chen nodded, understanding. There's something else. Richard Turner is dead. He died in December from cancer. Apparently, he told the boys the truth before he died and gave them money to return. They've been waiting for the right moment for years. Mary absorbed this information, feeling nothing at the news of Richard's death. She'd spent 16 years hating him, and now he was just gone. It felt anticlimactic. I want to call them, Mary said suddenly. Can I call them? Do they want to talk to me? Chen pulled out her phone. They asked me to give you this number. It's Caleb's cell. They're waiting for your call. Mary took the phone with shaking hands. She stared at the number for a long moment, preparing herself for a conversation she'd rehearsed in her mind 10,000 times but still had no idea how to begin. She dialed. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Hello? The voice was male, deep, uncertain, speaking English with a slight accent. Caleb? Mary's voice broke on the name. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "Mom?" And just like that, after 16 years of silence, Mary Turner was speaking to her son again. Mexico City, Mexico, March 10th, 2023. Caleb sat on the edge of the hotel bed, his phone pressed against his ear, tears streaming down his face as he heard his mother's voice for the first time in 20 years. Diego stood nearby, his own eyes wet, waiting his turn. "Mom," Caleb repeated, the word feeling foreign and familiar all at once. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry we couldn't find our way back sooner." "No," Mary said firmly through her own tears. "No apologies. You're alive. You're safe. That's all that matters. My boys are alive." They talked for 2 hours that first night. Caleb told her about their life in Mexico, the schools they'd attended, the jobs they'd worked, the lies Richard had told them. He explained how they'd discovered the truth in 2012 but had been trapped by circumstance, by lack of resources, by fear. He told her about Richard's death and his final confession. Then Diego took the phone, his voice smaller, more uncertain. He'd been only 9 when he was taken, and his memories of Mary were hazier than Caleb's. "I don't remember much," he admitted, "but Caleb used to tell me stories about you, about how you'd sing to us and make us sandwiches with the crust cut off and kiss our foreheads before school." "I remember all of it," Mary said, her voice thick with emotion. "Every single day, every single moment. And we're going to make new memories now, better ones." When they finally hung up, both brothers sat in stunned silence, processing the reality that they'd just spoken to their mother after 2 decades. The woman they'd thought was dead, the woman who'd never stopped searching. "We're going home," Diego whispered. "We're actually going home." But neither brother was naive enough to think it would be simple. Kearney, Nebraska, March 24th, 2023. The day Caleb and Diego Turner returned to American soil. News crews from across the country descended on Kearney. The story had exploded. Missing children found alive after 20 years. A mother's unwavering faith vindicated. A kidnapping father's deathbed confession. It had all the elements of a media sensation. Mary had asked for privacy for the actual reunion, and law enforcement had honored that request. When Caleb and Diego's plane landed at Epley Airfield in Omaha, they were met by Detective Chen and escorted to an unmarked vehicle. The drive to Kearney took 2 hours, 2 hours during which both brothers stared out the window at the landscape of their birth state, trying to recognize something, anything. "It's flatter than I remembered," Caleb said quietly. "Everything is," Diego replied. They pulled up to Mary's house on Elm Street just before sunset. The house looked smaller than Caleb's fragmentary memories suggested, but the big tree in the front yard was the same. The porch swing was the same. Even the old Honda in the driveway was the same car from 2003, somehow still running. The front door opened before they could even get out of the car. Mary stood in the doorway, backlit by the interior lights, her hands pressed to her mouth. For a long moment, nobody moved. Caleb and Diego climbed out of the car slowly, their hearts pounding. They were 31 and 29 years old, grown men who stood taller than their mother now. But in that moment, they felt like children again. "Caleb," Mary breathed, taking a tentative step forward. "Ethan." "It's Diego now," the younger brother said automatically, then added hastily, "But Ethan is okay too. I can be Ethan again." "You can be whoever you need to be," Mary said. And then she was running across the yard and the brothers were moving to meet her, and they were embracing in a tangle of arms and tears and 20 years of grief pouring out all at once. Mary sobbed into Caleb's shoulder while clutching Diego's hand. The brothers held her carefully, afraid she might break. This woman who was simultaneously a stranger and the most important person in their lives. She was smaller than they'd imagined, frailer, with gray streaking through her hair and lines on her face that grief had carved deep. "I never stopped looking," Mary gasped between sobs. "Not for 1 day, not for 1 hour. I knew you were out there. I knew you'd come home. We tried," Caleb said, his own voice breaking. "We tried to find a way back." They stood like that for a long time in the fading light, a family reassembling itself from broken pieces. Inside the house, Mary had prepared their old bedrooms exactly as they'd been in 2003. Caleb's room still had his Nebraska Cornhuskers posters, his baseball trophies, his CD collection of early 2000s pop punk. Diego's room had his toy cars, his Harry Potter books, his drawings of dinosaurs. The brothers stood in their respective doorways, staring at shrines to children who no longer existed. "This is a lot," Diego said quietly to Caleb later, when Mary was downstairs making dinner. "Yeah," Caleb agreed. But she needed to keep something. We can't take that away from her. Dinner was awkward in the way that all impossible situations are awkward. Mary had made spaghetti. She remembered it was Richard's go-to meal, and it felt like a small connection to maintain. But conversation was stilted, full of long pauses and careful navigation around painful subjects. "Tell me about Mexico," Mary prompted. "What was it like?" Caleb and Diego exchanged glances, trying to figure out how to summarize 15 years of life built on a lie. They told her about school, about friends they'd made, about jobs at the manufacturing plant. They left out the harder parts: the poverty, the constant moving, the way Richard's paranoia had isolated them, the years of knowing they'd been stolen but feeling powerless to do anything about it. "Did he?" Mary's voice caught. "Did he treat you well? Richard?" It was the question she'd been terrified to ask but needed to know. If her sons had been abused, if they'd suffered beyond just losing her. "He wasn't a bad father," Caleb said slowly, choosing his words with care. "He was wrong. What he did was unforgivable. But he fed us, clothed us, sent us to school. He helped with homework. He showed up to parent-teacher conferences." He paused. "He loved us in his own twisted way. That doesn't excuse what he did to you or to us, but it's the truth." Mary absorbed this, nodding slowly. "I'm glad you weren't hurt. That's something at least." Later, after Diego had gone to bed in his childhood room that felt like a museum exhibit, Caleb found Mary sitting on the porch swing, staring out at the dark street. "Can't sleep?" he asked, sitting down beside her. "I keep thinking I'm going to wake up," Mary admitted, "that this is a dream and you'll be gone again in the morning." "We're not going anywhere," Caleb assured her. "We're home now." "Are you, though?" Mary turned to look at him, her eyes reflecting the streetlight. "This is home for me, but you've lived in Mexico for most of your lives. Your friends are there, your life is there. Are you sure you want to stay in Nebraska?" It was a fair question, one Caleb had been wrestling with since they'd made the decision to return. "Honestly, I don't know. Diego and I need to figure out what comes next. We need to get American IDs reissued, social security cards, driver's licenses. We need to decide what we want to do for work. We need to..." He trailed off, overwhelmed by the enormity of rebuilding lives that had been interrupted 2 decades ago. "You need time," Mary said gently. "And that's okay. I've waited 20 years. I can wait a little longer while you figure things out." They sat together in comfortable silence, the summer night warm and still around them. Kearney, Nebraska, June 2023. The first few months back in the United States were a whirlwind of media attention, legal proceedings, and adjustment. Caleb and Diego gave one televised interview to a major network, then politely declined all other requests. Their story had captured the nation's attention, but they wanted privacy to process their trauma and rebuild their lives. The legal situation was complex. Richard Turner was dead, so there would be no prosecution. But there were bureaucratic nightmares to untangle, getting their legal identities restored, dealing with questions about why they hadn't come forward sooner, navigating the complexities of having lived as different people for 20 years. "The system isn't designed for this," their lawyer explained during one particularly frustrating meeting. "You were American citizens who disappeared and lived as undocumented Mexican nationals for 2 decades. Then you returned as adults. Every agency we deal with has to create a special protocol just for your case." Financially, they qualified for various victim compensation programs, which helped. Mary's house was paid off, and between her salary and the brothers' eventual employment, Diego got hired at a local auto shop. Caleb started taking classes at the University of Nebraska at Kearney. They managed. But the emotional adjustment was harder than any of them had anticipated. Diego struggled with identity issues, torn between the person he'd been as Ethan Turner and the person he'd become as Diego Hernandez. He started seeing a therapist who specialized in trauma, and slowly began to piece together a sense of self that incorporated both lives. Caleb dealt with anger, at Richard for stealing them, at the system that had failed to find them, at himself for not acting sooner when he'd discovered the truth. He threw himself into his studies, focusing on criminal justice, driven by a desire to understand how their case had fallen through the cracks. Mary tried to be patient, to give them space while also craving the closeness she'd dreamed about for 20 years. But it was hard. These weren't the children she'd lost. They were men with their own lives, their own trauma, their own ways of coping. "I keep wanting them to need me," Mary confessed to Patricia one afternoon. "I want them to need their mother, but they're 30 years old. They've been taking care of themselves for years." "They do need you," Patricia said gently. Just not in the way you imagined. You're building a new relationship from scratch. That takes time. There were good days and hard days. Good days like when Diego taught Mary to make proper Mexican tamales, and they spent an afternoon cooking together, laughing at Mary's clumsy attempts to fold the corn husks correctly. Hard days like when Caleb had a nightmare about being chased and woke up screaming, and Mary tried to comfort him but he pulled away, not ready to be that vulnerable. They celebrated Caleb's 32nd birthday in August with a small party. Just Mary, Patricia, Detective Chen, and a few neighbors who'd never forgotten. Diego made a cake using a recipe from their time in Mexico, and for a few hours it felt almost normal. Make a wish, Mary said as Caleb leaned over the candles. Caleb closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were wet. I don't need to wish for anything, he said. I already got my wish, we're home. Kearney, Nebraska, March 2024. 1 year after their reunion, Caleb, Diego, and Mary drove to the cemetery where Richard Turner's ashes had been scattered by the crematorium in Mexico. There was no marker, no memorial. He'd been cremated as Roberto Hernandez, and his ashes had been disposed of without ceremony. They stood in silence for a long time, each processing their complicated feelings toward the man who'd shaped their lives in such destructive ways. I hated him for so long, Mary finally said, but now I just feel empty. He's dead, and all that hate doesn't have anywhere to go. He was sick, Diego said quietly. Not just at the end with the cancer. He was sick in his mind. He convinced himself that taking us was the right thing to do. That doesn't excuse what he did, Caleb added firmly, but it does explain it. He was a broken person who broke other people. Mary nodded slowly. I forgive him, she said, surprising herself as much as her sons. Not for him, he's beyond caring, but for me. I forgive him so I can let go of all this anger I've been carrying. It's too heavy to keep carrying. They left the cemetery feeling lighter somehow, as if they'd laid to rest more than just Richard's memory. Kearney, Nebraska, July 14th, 2024. 21 years after Ethan and Caleb Turner disappeared, Mary stood on the steps of Lincoln Elementary School for the final time. This year, the gathering was different. Instead of a vigil for missing children, it was a celebration of resilience, recovery, and reunion, and Caleb and Diego stood beside their mother, along with Patricia, Detective Chen, and dozens of families affected by parental abduction. Mary had become an advocate for missing children in the year since her son's return, working with organizations to improve the systems that had failed her family. Our story doesn't have a typical ending, Mary told the assembled crowd. My sons came home, which makes us the lucky ones, but they lost 20 years of their lives. I lost 20 years with them. That time is gone forever, and no amount of reunion can give it back. She paused, looking at Caleb and Diego, both standing tall and whole beside her. But we have today. We have tomorrow. We have the rest of our lives to build something new from the pieces of what was broken. And that's not nothing. That's everything. The crowd applauded, cameras flashed, and somewhere in the audience another mother of a missing child wiped away tears, holding on to hope that someday she'd get her own miracle. Kearney, Nebraska, present day. 18 months after their reunion, life had settled into something approaching normal for the Turner family. Caleb was in his second year at UNK, studying to become a social worker specializing in family reunification. Diego had been promoted to assistant manager at the auto shop and was dating a local teacher he'd met at a community event. They still had hard days, days when the weight of what they'd lost felt crushing, days when the scars of their trauma felt fresh and raw, days when they looked at each other and wondered who they might have been if their childhood hadn't been stolen. But they also had good days. Sunday dinners at Mary's house where they cooked together and laughed at bad jokes. Movie nights where Diego translated Spanish dialogue for Mary, teaching her his adopted language. Quiet evenings on the porch swing where they didn't need to talk, content just to be together. Do you ever regret coming back? Mary asked Caleb one evening as they sat in the kitchen, going through old photo albums from before 2003. Caleb looked up from a picture of himself at age 8, missing his front teeth, grinning at the camera. No, he said firmly. It's been hard, and it's been complicated, but I don't regret it. You deserved to know we were alive. We deserved to know the truth. Even though you lost everything you'd built in Mexico, we didn't lose everything. We brought the good parts with us, the language, the culture, the experiences, and we gained back what Richard took from us. We gained back our mother. Mary reached across the table and squeezed his hand. I'm so proud of both of you, not just for surviving but for thriving, for being strong enough to come home." Diego entered the kitchen, fresh from his shift at the shop, and grabbed a soda from the fridge. "What are we being emotional about now?" he teased. "Just talking about how awesome we are," Caleb said with a grin. "Obviously," Diego replied, sliding into a chair and reaching for the photo album. He flipped through pages of a childhood he barely remembered. Birthday parties and Christmas mornings and ordinary moments that had seemed unremarkable at the time, but were now precious beyond measure. He stopped at a picture from July 2003, taken just weeks before they disappeared. He and Caleb were in the backyard, playing with a water hose soaking wet and laughing. Mary was in the background, smiling at them with pure, uncomplicated joy. "We were so young," Diego murmured. "You still are," Mary said. "You're 29 years old. You have your whole lives ahead of you." "But we miss so much," Diego said softly. "High school proms, college experiences, first jobs, first heartbreaks, all the normal stuff that makes up a life. So make up for it now," Mary replied. "You can't get back what was stolen, but you can build something new, something better, something that honors both the children you were and the men you've become." Outside, the Nebraska sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Down the street, kids rode bikes home before dark, their laughter carrying on the summer breeze. It was an ordinary evening in an ordinary town, the kind of evening that Mary had dreamed about for 20 years, the kind of evening that Caleb and Diego had forgotten existed. "Hey," Caleb said suddenly, "want to go to the movies tomorrow? There's that new superhero thing playing." "Can't," Diego replied. "I have a date with Rachel." "Ooh, the teacher," Caleb teased. "This is getting serious." "Maybe," Diego said, but he was smiling. "She wants to meet you guys eventually, if that's okay." "Of course it's okay," Mary said warmly. "We'd love to meet her." They talked late into the evening, making plans, sharing stories, being a family. It wasn't the family they would have been if 2003 had never happened. It was different, shaped by trauma and loss and 20 years of separation. But it was theirs, hard-won and precious and real. And as Mary locked the door that night and watched her sons head upstairs to their rooms they'd slowly personalized, replacing childhood posters with adult possessions, she felt something she hadn't felt in 2 decades. Peace. Not happiness exactly. The scars were too deep for simple happiness. But peace. The peace of knowing her sons were safe, that they were home, that despite everything Richard Turner had done to destroy their family, they'd found their way back to each other. The Turner case would be studied for years to come, in criminal justice courses, in missing persons protocols, in discussions about parental abduction and international custody disputes. It would be featured in documentaries and true crime podcasts, dissected and analyzed and held up as both a cautionary tale and a miracle. But for Mary, Caleb, and Diego Turner, it was simply their life. Not the life they'd planned, not the life they'd deserved, but the life they'd built from the rubble of catastrophe. And somehow, improbably, impossibly, that was enough.